Convener of the Dundee Green Party. Liam MacArthur, MSP, Liberal Democrats, for the Liberal Democrats, is Education Spokesperson. We've got Gail Lithgow from Yes Scotland. Neil Bibby, MSP for Labour, as an Education Spokesperson. And the chair tonight is David Torrance, who's the Associate Director of 5 Million Questions. Liz Smith, MSP, Conservative Unionist Party, former education spokesperson, but happy to come along tonight, and we're grateful that you're still glad to come along. Michael Russell, SNP, Cabinet Minister for Education and Lifelong Learning. And finally, Principal Professor Pete Downs, who's also, alongside being the Principal of Dundee University, is the convener of University of Scotland. So it's a great panel tonight, exactly 1 year from the event, from the referendum. So I hope you all get involved, get engaged, ask any questions you've got, and have a good evening. Have a good evening, yeah.
Thanks very much for that very brief introduction, and thank you very much for coming along on a very nice evening. And as you said, exactly a year out from the referendum, the newspapers and television media today have been full of commentary from both sides of the debate. I think so far it's fair to say that education hasn't had a huge amount of airtime in the referendum debate. The economy, defence, foreign affairs. There are so many issues jostling for journalists and politicians' attention that perhaps there hasn't been as much on education. So we'll do our best to redress that balance this evening. Just a quick word about the format. It's going to be a bit like BBC's Question Time, hopefully a bit more interesting than recent editions. I'm going to kick off with some questions we've had submitted by students in advance, but I will do my best in the opening section to bring anyone in. If you have something to ask, feel free to put up your hand. But we'll move more fully to the Q&A section of the event in about 25 minutes. And we have until 8:30. So we'll try and get through as much as possible. It's quite a large panel. And I'll kick off with one of the questions submitted, which is, if a yes vote succeeded, how would the University of Dundee place itself in the UK European Union higher education field? And I think we should start with Education Secretary Mike Russell.
So with the University of Dundee. Well, I would have thought as successfully as it presently does. We have essentially the most successful higher education system in the world by head of population. We have a higher education system that competes with the very best in the world, as we know from all the rankings and indeed from those who want to come here. So I don't think independence presents any threat to the positioning in the world. In fact, what it may well do is to allow a more vigorous promotion to take place. One of the things I do when I'm abroad as a minister quite often is to promote Scottish higher education. And sometimes it's difficult to do because there are other messages, and those messages sometimes confuse people. What we need to do is have a very clear Scottish brand for higher education and a very clear Dundee brand, as we have a clear Edinburgh brand and a Stirling brand and a Glasgow brand. I don't think there's any threat at all to the position of Scottish universities in the world from independence. In fact, I think quite the opposite is the case.
And Pete, since you're the practitioner amongst us.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for the initial comment from Mike, because I did expect to get this question first. And the simple answer, of course, is that nothing will get in the way of this university's ambition. And part of that ambition, of course, from our latest work on establishing a new vision for the university, is to become, over 25 years, Scotland's leading university. That is something that we're all working extremely hard to do, but you can't have that scale of ambition without recognising the role that universities play, both locally and nationally and internationally. And I think that's the heart of the question as I see it. We have a core purpose that we defined recently to supersede our mission, and that's to transform lives. So our job is to transform lives, and we say that we want to do that locally and globally. And that means that we want to bring the world to Dundee in terms of international students, international partnerships, and supporting an international context of our research. And we want to do that because we want everybody who comes to this university to have global opportunities themselves and to see those global opportunities in action. But there are some, I think, issues that pertain to the constitutional situation after the referendum. I mean, for example, there is undoubtedly a very strong Scottish brand, and Mike already alluded to that in terms of the fact that Scottish universities, in many respects, punch above their weight within the UK. And I think that's really important. But there's also a UK brand that we have to recognise, and that's particularly important in terms of the infrastructure that exists to support research. Now, this has often been framed in the debate as being Scotland will have problems if it absents itself from this UK research infrastructure. I don't see it that way. I see that infrastructure as an ecosystem of mutual interdependency that's vital for all parts of the UK to succeed in terms of the research performed by its higher education institutions. So yes, there are elements and critical parts of that interdependency that are good for Scotland, but they're equally good for England and the other countries of the current UK. So I do think it's important that we seek to preserve elements of that infrastructure that are important to all of us, whatever the referendum decides in a year's time.
Okay, thank you. Neil, Pete mentions research funding, which has come up. I mean, roughly speaking, Scottish universities seem to get a bit more than a strict population share would dictate. Do you have concerns in that field were Scotland to become independent?
Well, the way I see it is that Dundee University thrives as it currently in the UK, and the UK university system. Figures from 2011 show that nearly 18,000 students studied here, and more than doubling in the size over the last 20 years. I know the university has an excellent research programme which continues to go from strength to strength, benefiting from cross-border collaboration. In 2011-12, Scottish universities received 14% of grants from UK charities and 14% of grants from UK industry. This support and type of funding is what I hope universities like Dundee will continue to benefit from in the future. And I think the best, most certain way of protecting our universities' research funding and reputation as a world leader in research is to remain part of the United Kingdom.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the second of questions submitted in advance, which is on finances. The question says, with a £4 billion deficit projected for an independent Scotland by 2016, 2017, obviously we can quibble over the figures. How can you assure people that Scottish domiciled students will continue to receive free further education? Liz?
Well, we can differ, obviously, very markedly on what the actual deficit is. I mean, I think let's get this in the right context, and the other speakers have said something to this effect already. Dundee University is first class, and it has to remain first class. And we have to look at that in the context, not just of the competition that you face in Scotland and within the UK, but what you're facing abroad. And I don't think we should underestimate in any sense the competition, the level of competition that you're facing from emerging countries with universities, and whether it's in the Far East or whether it's the very strong American universities, and to ensure that you are able to maintain that academic excellence that you undoubtedly have. I believe very firmly that this university is going to have to pull in more money than you have had, obviously, in the past. And I think that's true for all Scottish universities. And one of the areas that I have concern about, should Scotland vote to have independence, is whether there will be significant additional funding, which I believe, and I think if you read a lot of economic experts and a lot of people within the university sector themselves, they're all saying that the university sector, to be as strong as it is just now, needs to have additional funding. And that's why I believe that we can't just get that from the state.
Mike, do you want to come in briefly on that?
Well, those who talk about the future of universities, and there are many people, talk about a number of things that needs to happen. And indeed, University of Scotland, which Pete, of course, is president of the chair, has a very interesting fact sheet out, I think, last week, that talks about the things that make the Scottish university system work. Finance is only one of them, but we have actually increased finance for university in Scotland by 15%, I think, in the last 3 years. The equivalent in the rest of the UK is a drop of 40%. So I think we have put our money where our intention and our mouth is. But there are a number of other things which we've done in Scotland that have contributed to the way in which the university sector works. For example, the University of Scotland paper talks a lot about autonomy of the institutions and claims that Scottish universities are amongst the most autonomous in the world. This is what the University of Scotland say, and we have that sitting there. So whether future challenges come, then the universities are already meeting them, and they're already meeting them in the next challenge, which is a question of online learning. I mean, one of the big things that's happening worldwide now is a way in which learning in universities is moving online. Some of it is moving free online, which is a very considerable challenge. And Scottish universities are rising to that challenge with participation, for example, with the Open University and with a variety of others in putting in place what are called MOOCs. So there's a range of challenges, Liz, that you're addressing. And those challenges include technological challenges, but where the financial challenges exist, we're meeting them and continue to meet them. Peter's talked about research. We've increased substantially research funding. The Global Excellence Initiative we've just put in place allows universities to recruit more postgraduates and to compete for staff globally, and that's vital because that's the lifeblood of the future of higher education. So in all those areas, we are competing. The area that will damage us most is if we look as if we don't want to have students from the rest of the world, and one of the biggest problems we have in higher education in Scotland is, I'm afraid to say, the immigration policy from the UK, which is giving the impression that universities do not wish to attract students from elsewhere. We need to change that, and that means having an immigration policy in Scotland that attracts students, and that's one of the other, in my view, great benefits of independence.
Okay, Mike, and those... The Education Secretary raises some interesting issues I'm sure we'll return to. Liam, your party, of course, in the first Scottish Executive Coalition back in 1999, made great play of abolishing tuition fees or upfront tuition fees. Is free tuition something you think is sustainable if Scotland is in or out of the United Kingdom?
Well, I think it's tempting to try and cast this debate into an argument between those who are arguing that with a yes vote next year, we'll all go to hell in a handcart or we'll move seamlessly into the sunlit uplands. And I think the truth lies somewhere probably in between, in that actually the bigger concern is the level of uncertainty there are in a number of areas. I think we've touched on some of those. I hear what Pete says in terms of the ecosystem around the general UK university system and particularly with relation to research council funding. But there's no doubt that it is less certain that ecosystem would be remain undisrupted were we to move down a pathway of separation in a range of other spheres. I think in terms of the funding that Mike has alluded to, I think there is no doubt that there's been a high priority placed on that and significant funds put in, building on what the previous Scottish Executive committed. But nevertheless, I think there are challenges, not least in terms of creating a situation where students coming from the rest of the UK ultimately are treated in the same way as students from the rest of the UK and are entitled to the same support and provision as Scots domiciled students. And that undoubtedly places or would place considerable strain on the current budgets and require additional funding were the case. So I think there is no doubt that Mike will make a claim that the Scottish Government to date has attached a priority to this and funded it. I would argue that with a yes vote next year, a lot of these calculations get thrown into considerable uncertainty. We've not yet heard answers that are remotely convincing that they have a plan for dealing with those.
Gail, do you want to come in on that from a Yes Scotland perspective?
I wondered how long it would take for uncertainty was the buzzword of the evening, as it always seems to come up. And I mean, the No campaign will tell you that the future is uncertain if you vote yes. But for me, as a young person in Scotland today, you know, the future is equally uncertain if you stay inside the UK. So if, for example, either the Tories or Labour or the Lib Dems in the UK decide to hike up tuition fees or screw around with their further and higher education sectors further, that affects the Barnett consequentials that comes back to Scotland. It then affects the amount of money that the Scottish Government has to spend on us, on further and higher education in Scotland, which will create more uncertainty than anything else. I have no faith whatsoever that any of the London parties have the ability to prioritise Scottish students and the young people of Scotland and make sure that we're not kind of graduating and receiving no jobs that, you know, I've got no faith that they're able to actually bring the economy back and invest in our future. So for me, uncertainty, you know, there's two roads ahead of you here. It's uncertain if you vote yes, it's uncertain if you vote no. But if you create your own future, you can be more certain of your own future. So if we have the decision-making powers in our own hands and we're able to hold these politicians accountable better, because when we vote in Scotland, our vote matters more, and we're not kind of electing a Tory government that none of us in Scotland voted for, we're actually then able to hold them more accountable. So for me, for my certainty, I would much prefer to hold them accountable in Edinburgh.
Okay, thank you. Pauline, Mike and others have touched upon international students, and of course there are many international students, not just at Dundee University, but most universities in Scotland and the UK. It relates to the third and last question that was submitted in advance. How will being independent affect international student visas? But I suppose to cast it more widely, how important is that market, if we can call it that? And how do you see an independent Scotland, if that happens, affecting it?
Well, it's a really interesting question, because at the end of the day, it's about immigration as it is about education. I mean, what's happening in relation to students from Tier 4 from Tier 4 countries, for example? It's more about seeing them as potential terrorists than it is potential students. So I think it does have an economic impact. I think it also, though, ultimately, in terms of completely disadvantages the whole of the university sector in Scotland. At the end of the day, you know, Scotland has a long reputation of a very good education system. And I think to be lumped in with what the UK government is doing around immigration. So for nothing else, I think a yes vote, which will allow immigration policy to pass to Holyrood, would actually have a significant impact on the wider further education sector in relation to Europe and in relation to the world, and particularly in relation to the Tier 4 countries, which right now, I think, are beginning to realise that they have alternatives like Australia, like Canada, and are actually, by the time, you know, you'd be worried that by the time something's done about these immigration issues around student visas, that actually they won't come here because they'll have discovered that there are other options. So I think there's an economic impact. I think there's an issue of immigration, as well as an impact around the perception of Scottish universities. So yeah, we are being tarnished by a UK immigration policy. I think that will ultimately affect the university sector, absolutely.
Okay, I think Liam wants to come back on that.
Just very quick, I mean, I think this is probably an area where you're going to find unanimity of view across the panel in terms of some of the messages that have gone out around immigration and the extent to which students coming to the UK have been caught up in a wider policy agenda, which, frankly, I have no truck with whatsoever. Pete was on a panel with Vince Cable at a conference in Dundee very recently, where he didn't miss the man and hit the wall in laying out his objections to this policy. And I think it's part of a package with some of what emanates from the Home Office at the moment, driven by an agenda and certain elements within the Conservative Party. I think Liz is an honourable exception to that. David Willett's her counterpart at a UK level likewise. But nevertheless, it's driven by a wider agenda, which, as I say, I find fairly reprehensible. It's part of a piece with the utterly abhorrent Go Home campaign that was being rolled out in parts of Scotland and other parts of the UK. But let's not forget, the more that the SNP and the Yes campaign claimed that what we need is a separate immigration policy, the ecosystem that Pete talks about is disrupted. The more of a difference there is between immigration north and south of the border, the greater the amount of effort and cost that will go into policing the border between those two countries. And that is a simple fact. If you have a separate immigration system, north and south of the border, where there is a complete departure, then all you do is create the situation where that needs to be monitored more closely. And that's, I think, I can't see any way around that. And that's what the SNP have failed to articulate.
Okay, I'll take Mike first and then Liz.
You have, Liam, and I hope you did it unintentionally. You have just told us that we must live with injustice. that we must actually always live with an immigration policy that is wrong, because you have said it is wrong, but you have said that if you have a separate policy, it has to be policed, so we have to live with it. Well, I'm not prepared to live with it. The solution to this one is as plain as anything. And you know, I apologise if talking about independence just appears to be common sense, but having argued for it for most of my adult life, it does appear to be common sense. If you disagree with the policy that is set elsewhere by a government for which you did not vote, you have to, in all conscience, come to, it's Occam's razor, the simplest solution, which is to have that policy repatriated to your own country. And the only way to repatriate that policy to your own country is to have an independent Scotland that runs its own migration policy. You can't just live with the injustice of a policy that is wrong. It's not just wrong for this university. As a constituency MSP, I've been trying to deal with a case today that is wrong for one of my constituents, who is being appallingly treated by the Home Office. And yet I am exhorted, apparently, to accept this because the difficulty of having an immigration policy in Scotland is too great. Well, I'm sorry, I don't accept injustice. I don't accept this as the right thing to do. And if the way to change it is to have independence, I'm for independence.
Okay, let's if we can try and steer it back onto the impact on students.
Well, let me say very clearly, I'm one of the Conservatives who didn't agree with much of what the Westminster government did in this respect. I'm on record in Parliament in saying that and several other forums like this. But at the back of that, I do think we have to remember, and this is some common sense, that one of the reasons why the Westminster government decided it had to do something about this policy was because of a very critical audit report that came in 2009 about the number of illegal students who were coming into the UK. Now, that is a serious problem. That had to be dealt with, but I don't think it was dealt with sensitively. I think that international students are overwhelmingly beneficial to the university sector. I remember when University Scotland lobbied me very strongly about this, I wrote immediately to David Willits, and I did so again on the basis of some of the facts that were being presented. So I don't think the Westminster government has got this right, but I do think we should see it in the context that we couldn't just have the system before that because it wasn't working either.
It's interesting to see the coalition representatives here united in their criticism.
So, David, could I just turn this back to students, which is what you asked?
Sure,
It is about students. There is a monetary value that we can place on overseas students, but that's not the point. The overseas students in our university amount to about 10% of our campus students, and about 25% when we include distance learning and other things of that kind. These students massively enrich the campus, they massively enrich the city, they provide value over and beyond anything related to finance and everything to do with culture. And the notion all universities should have that their students who learn and study on their campuses are learning about becoming global citizens. And they can't do that if they're isolated from their international peers and compatriots. So to me, it doesn't matter what the constitutional system we have is. This is just wrong and it needs fixing.
Okay. And Neil?
I agree entirely.
I think absolutely international students play a fantastic role in universities, but also in the local economy as well. They bring massive benefits. Obviously, they come to study here because of high-quality teaching, high-quality research. But I think it's also worth remembering the work that the British government do, the Foreign Office and the British Council do abroad to market our universities right across the globe. The UK has over 270 embassies with 12,000 staff. Now, they're not just handy if you get into a spot of bother abroad. They're also working to sell our British institutions in different parts of the world. I was in Taiwan last year, and I met with the British Foreign Office and Council there, and they are actively creating links between schools there and education institutions here. And for example, Edinburgh University is benefiting from that just now. So there will be work being done by the British Government Foreign Office and the British Council to benefit Dundee University. There was 207,000 207 student visas issued in the UK. obviously there needs to be a visa system that ensures that we have genuine students coming here to study, and I would agree with that point. But the challenge that a separate Scotland would face in that regard is that we do live on the same island, and you can't have a vastly different immigration policy and maintain open borders at the same time, and that's just a fact. The example of Ireland has been used recently in this debate, and Ireland took the decision to opt out of Schengen, just like the UK, because they wanted to maintain open borders. So if Ireland did it, why would an independent Scotland not do the same?
Okay, that concludes the opening questions. That was a very lively discussion, especially in the last point. Time now for questions from the audience. This chap was first in the front row. But wait for the microphone.
Quick, come on. We should need more athletic mic carriers. Oh, he's chosen his own.
No. This chap here, I'll get over to that side in a moment.
Hello everyone, my name is Živko Željaskov. First of all, thank you very much for coming here tonight. I'm actually an international student, so I was very much interested in the debate. I would be interested actually to hear more about the Home Office and the British Council, because I'm a Bulgarian citizen, and as Bulgarian citizens, you might know Bulgarian citizens actually have work restrictions for the UK up until January 1st, 2014. A lot of Bulgarian and Romanian citizens had to deal with the Home Office, and let me just say that they're not great at that at all. Plus, I would also be interested to hear more about your position in terms of EU funding, because during the new program period from 2014 to 2020, a lot of money are going to go to higher education, so that would be quite interesting for me to hear. Thank you very much.
Good. Excuse me. Pauline, do you want to say something about that?
Okay, coming back to the Home Office, well, I think the Home Office makes it difficult because I think it's trying to implement immigration policy through education. But we've already discussed that. In terms of the new EU funding, which is for the 2020 strategy, I mean, a lot of it will be going to education. I think that's an opportunity for Scotland to be aware of. And I mean, I know that most universities in Scotland are part of the Bologna process, for example. So they already share students and they share experiences and stuff like this. So from that point of view, I think it'll be a good thing. But I mean, beyond that, I think mirroring, I'm making the new EU structural funds tying up to EU 2020 strategy in terms of trying to produce a more cohesive social Europe, I think is all part of that. And that's where the immigration thing with the Home Office doesn't quite fit, because actually, you know, if we don't go yes and we vote no, we could come out of the EU. And then I think we're in a whole different ballgame when it comes to the Bologna process, when it comes to EU structural funds and actually kind of bringing money into Scotland and bringing students into Scotland. So there's a big issue, I think, around.
Pete, do you want to say a bit more about that?
Well, I would comment on the second part of that question about EU funding, which I think is vitally important. I mean, the EU obviously had great problems bringing together its budget, and it was, I think, very a positive statement for the funding of research that the Horizon 2020 budget, whilst being reduced slightly, was actually held up extremely well. It's a fantastic opportunity for all Scottish institutions, and also it's a great force for partnership between institutions throughout Europe. It's also a great force for the mobility of both staff and students throughout the European community. So many of the things that I spoke about in a general sense around students and the immigration rules are also very strongly supported by EU policy. They create a community that is much wider than the narrow community of a city or of a single nation. And that's vital for our students, and it's vital for us to realize our research objectives, and it's even more important for us to realize the impact of that research on economic growth and development.
Mike, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me echo your view about the Home Office. You echo everybody's view that comes in confrontation with the Home Office and its predecessor, the UKBA. I mean, it's a thoroughly unpleasant experience for most people involved. But I led the first Scottish delegation to the Bologna process last year. And I think it's vital we carry on building our involvement in that. We've now got a separate delegation. It works exceptionally well. We're one of only 3 countries in Europe that's increased expenditure on higher education in the last 2 years. And we can learn a great deal from it, but we can participate greatly in the decision making. And we are actually fully Bologna compliant, one of the few countries that is. However, the real difficulty arises when we don't sit there at the top table. If you go, the meeting I was at was in Bucharest, and I sat in the Palace of the People in this enormous room, and every country participated in discussion. But I've gone as a minister, in other portfolios, I've gone as a minister to the European Council of Ministers. And if I might, David, just tell one very short story about it, because it illustrates the problem of participation in decision-making. I went as Environment Minister to the European Fisheries Council on one occasion to represent Scotland because Richard Lochhead couldn't go. The leader of the delegation was a UK peer, Jeff Rooker, a very nice man. By his own admission, he had never been to Luxembourg and he had never been to a Fisheries Council. But he sat in the front seat. And all his briefing, the main subject was the North Sea Cod Recovery Plan, something I'm sure everybody is fully familiar with in this room. All the work on it was done by Scottish civil servants. He was the one who was taking that brief. And at the end, when there was what they call a table round, that is when every minister participates from every country, they went down that room and all the fishing ministers from every country in Europe, including the Luxembourg fisheries minister, and that is not a full-time job, every single one of them contributed. The only one who didn't was me, because we had no speaking rights and we were not permitted to speak. Now, there is nothing we do that could not be better than that. And in terms of participation, Horizon 2020, we'll do a great deal. I've discussed it with the Commissioner. I've been to do it. But how much better if we were in there setting the funding, just as we should be, and then making the decisions. I think that is also incontestable. We have to be there, we have to take part, we have to help make the decisions, and then we'll enthusiastically work with others to carry it out.
Okay. Now, unless anyone wants to launch a spirited defence of the Home Office, we'll probably move on to the next question.
Or the Cod Recovery Plan.
Or the Cod Recovery Plan. This lady here.
Hello. Obviously, you've all made a deal of a recurring theme from the nationalists is to make a big deal of the difference, because that is a necessary requirement to justify chopping up the country, isn't it? And tuition fees for Scots students is held out as an example of how different Scotland will be and is from the rest of the UK. In fact, Alex Salmond has said that the rocks will melt in the sun before he sees tuition fees introduced into Scotland. And it's held out as the prize for voting for breaking up the UK. And in fact, it's held out as a price of the nation.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Yes. And as you've all also mentioned, universities are now going to be everything about higher education is becoming marketised and commodified, and you have to compete in a global market. So what you haven't mentioned is the elephant in the room, and that is the regulator of regulators called the EU Competition Commission. So when you talk about an independent Scotland in the EU with a neoliberal project which is intent on creating a market in higher education, how can you sell to the Scottish public the idea that free tuition fees is going to be sustainable, it's going to be acceptable in a harmonised market, when you have to all sorts of things under state aid and EU competition laws, such as
I think
setting and capping fees, allocation of student places, is foreclosure on markets.
Sure.
All of these things are challengeable. And so, on the one hand, you're telling Scots that they're going to get one thing,
have a question there.
and they're not.
I'll let Liz respond first.
Can I just say, I think you raise a very important question about the issue of funding. Now, the Nationalists make a perfectly logical case that they believe that funding should be undertaken by the state. It's a perfectly logical position. I don't agree with that. But I think the question to the Nationalists, if Scotland was to vote for independence, is to what extent can that funding be obviously sustained through the taxpayer? Where does that money come from? The question I would ask to Mike Russell is, how are you going to pay for that? Scottish taxpayers are going to have to take the burden of that. If we were to be in the EU, as we suggested, then obviously, by definition, we have to have a situation where the rest of the UK students would actually be classified as, but they would, well, my point is, though, that they would then have to have their fees paid by the Scottish Government. Because, yes, they would.
No,
they would. They would have to, because they would then be classified. Well,
why would they privilege Scotland over all the other 27 member states in that respect?
Sorry, they may well be in the EU. That's a case that the Nationalists have argued. But by definition, because of the EU regulations, and I've never heard an argument yet from the Nationalists that points to the contrary of this, the rest of the UK students would have to be treated on exactly the same basis. Now, that in itself adds about £150 million extra of state burden. My question to the Nationalists is, how are you going to fund that?
Okay, I'll come to Gail in a second, but I'll take my time. Mike, this is a serious issue.
Oh, it is a very serious issue. Right. Let's talk about future funding patterns. In one of your earlier questions, you asked about a deficit of £4 billion in an independent Scotland in 1617, and this was meant to be the killer blow. And if killer blow is also either a combination of some sort of huge super state that is going to stop every other state doing things, which actually is not the case in education, because the education is not part of that competence. So I think your question is based on a fallacy. I don't really want to debate it, because what I really want to say is I just don't recognise that. But let me come to the figures. In the year that, and this is a figure that comes from Danny Alexander, this is the year that projects a Scottish deficit of £4 billion in 1617. I think I'd be happy to give you a prize of what the figures actually say for the UK deficit in that year. It is £67 billion. It then says that the UK will not have a surplus for another 50 years. So if we're looking forward, we're looking at a number of states with different difficulties in funding, and they have to decide upon their funding priorities. Now, the Scottish Government has said, this current Scottish Government has said, because other people may in time be the Government of Scotland, hopefully the Government of an independent Scotland, in those circumstances, they may have a different priority. But this government has said that is what we're paying at the moment, and what we'll continue to pay and increase, is an affordable sum for a national priority, as it would be for the National Health Service. Because we view higher education particularly as a good for the whole of society. Higher education is the third largest, I think, earner in Scotland, in the University of Scotland recent report. In those circumstances, this is a vital part of our infrastructure which requires that investment for the good of the nation and for the future of the nation. Now, if I can just deal with this question of students. In the white paper, which your leader today was greatly anticipating when it comes out, you will, I hope, see this argument laid out in greater detail. But I can tell you that I am intrigued and fascinated by the legal opinion from University of Scotland, Anderson Strathern's legal opinion, I think, which indicates that there are ways in which the current situation of charging could continue. I would rather not do that, because I don't believe in the marketisation of higher education. And I don't believe in tuition fees of £9,000 that are being charged south of the border, the highest tuition fees in Europe. I don't believe in perpetual debt for higher education. I go along with Joseph Stiglitz in his view that this is already the major cause of social division in the United States, and it will become that south of the border. But whilst that still exists from a government we didn't elect, we have to defend our university system and make sure our students study here. When the white paper comes out, you will understand there are ways this can be done in European law, and I will, if I'm still Education Minister at that time, defend to the hilt the opportunity for Scottish students to study in Scotland at Scottish universities, which remains my priority.
Okay, Mike. Gail, do you want to come in on? in on that.
Just, I mean, Mike pretty much covered a lot of what I was going to say. The questioner might be interested in reading about some of the trends back removing tuition fees. There's two German lenders that have actually removed tuition fees, and they're going back to a kind of publicly funded model. So you might be interested in reading that, because to me, education and markets, it makes me feel a little bit icky, because education for me is not about money or that, and it's
EU Commission.
yeah. Well,
It's a market. It's a single market.
I'm sure Mike would like to tell that to the EU Commission, but he's probably not allowed to.
Liam, do you want to come in on that?
I mean,
What is your position on fees? Just to clarify.
Well, we've supported the Scottish Government in the position we've taken. We took the decision.
What does that mean?
Well,
In removing backdoor tuition fees, or?
Well, in removing
All?
tuition fees, we supported the abolition then of the graduate endowment in the last Parliament, and I think as Mike will probably testify, we've supported on at least 2 or 3 separate occasions in the Parliament a maintenance of the structure of funding in Scotland as it currently is. I mean, whatever happens south of the border is not going to cease to exist on the basis of either a yes or a no vote next year, and therefore we will continue to have to respond to that for the very reasons that Pete talked about earlier on, about the flows of students that currently exist, the campuses that benefit from those flows north and south of the border, but also from overseas. And therefore, I think there is always going to be an impact. We've looked at the situation in terms of Scottish universities operating in an international market. And I simply don't accept what Mike has said about the implications of a yes vote next year on the situation with regards to the rest of the UK students. If it were as simple as that, why on earth is it that we have not seen from the Scottish Government an exercise in putting this through the European Commission to get a definitive ruling? I mean, it beggars belief. You can't.
Nobody who isn't a member state can get a definitive ruling from the EU. That's the issue. We've asked the UK government to get definitive rulings and they remove it. But I'm sure you anticipate the white paper as hotly as this party, and you will find it a fascinating read on this topic and many others.
Okay, the gentleman in the red shirt, just there.
Wait for the
microphone's just coming. Do you want to use the microphone?
Right, I moved back from England just maybe 3 years in October, and a friend of mine there, her daughter, who left school at 16, went on to college. Well, several of the friends who went along with her then were then left because, well, the parents couldn't really afford to keep them in the class. Now, if 16 and 17-year-olds can be charged for going to college, now I realise this is university we're talking here, but it's along the same thing, tuition fees. If 16 and 17-year-olds can be charged for going to college, how long will it take before they introduce tuition fees for 5th and 6th form colleges in England and Wales, and I'm not sure of the situation in Ireland. What did well, obviously, Liam made his point there just now that they backed up the Scottish Government. And what would the panel say to that? Would you back it in England? And if so, would you still go along with basically the way your policies shaping for Scotland as well, in which case you support tuition fees?
Neil? What is your position on tuition fees?
Well, I want to see a well-funded and resourced education system and quality and well-funded universities here in Scotland. And I want this because we need to maintain our position in the globe, and we need more money to help the poorest students get to university. Now, the Labour Party is having a review of its policy at the moment, but we needed to debate and agree on the best way to finance our universities, and that's been quite documented. I think there's a need for a review of how we fund higher and further education, and I think that's what we're doing at the moment, and we need to debate that going forward. But there's an interesting point about what you said about access to university and supporting the poorest students, because, you know, Mike can talk about, we offer free education, and absolutely is entitled to do that, but if you look at the detail, for example, support for the poorest students to get to university, the amount paid in bursaries to the poorest students in 2011-12 fell by £20 million. So there have been cuts to the bursaries for the poorest students in Scotland. The maximum bursary for a student in Scotland is £1,750. In England, it's £3,354. And Wales and Northern Ireland also offer better student support for poorer students. So these are, you know, Mike could argue that everything in the garden's rosy in terms of higher education in Scotland. It isn't. We need to do far more to support the poorest students. The Scottish Government is also slashing college courses for kids in Dundee and right across Scotland. So that we need to properly fund and resource our education system, and that has to be the priority.
Okay, Pete, access has been an issue over the past few weeks. There's been a lot of research on social mobility and people from poorer backgrounds getting into universities. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so it's certainly been a very strong policy initiative and drive from the current Scottish Government, and particularly from NUS Scotland, National Union of Students Scotland, that suggesting that Scottish universities are not pulling their weight in terms of making university places accessible to those from all backgrounds. And I think the evidence is equivocal on that, but what isn't equivocal at all is that we absolutely have to show commitment to ensuring that universities are open and accessible to all who can benefit from them. One of my concerns, and one of the University of Scotland's concerns, is the measures we use to define those who are in come from deprived backgrounds. We use the MD20, MD40 methodology, which depends upon postcodes, and it's clearly a very poor way to define accurately. Having said that, though, there's not a bad correlation. If you get that right, you probably get quite a lot of other things right. So as a convenient measure, it's not stupid. But what we would like to see is autonomous institutions, knowing the constituencies in which they operate, being able to devise an appropriate widening access strategy for their region, for their university, with their particular mission. And in that way, not fall behind the curve as measured by some sort of relatively arbitrary means, but actually be striding ahead in this particularly important area of social inclusivity.
Okay. Mike, some research, I think, did appear to suggest that in England that this had improved vis-a-vis Scotland. Is that correct?
Well, I don't think that research was in actual fact saying that, but I want to, before I come to that point, it's an interesting one, let me just deal with Pete's point, because I think we've got to the position, Pete, that you're talking about. We had, and it's not the secrets of the confessional, you and I had many a long discussion in the process of the bill to try and get to the position where the universities would be, you representing University of Scotland, comfortable with the outcome agreement process, which established in law wider access. And I think we are at that position, the flexibility that you will have in the outcome agreement process to make sure that you're looking at your local indicators, but you're also looking at what the national indicators are and making them work for you. And I think we've got that in place. My regret about that process is not that we put in law widening access, because I felt that was absolutely right to do. My regret is that unfortunately neither Labour nor the Liberal Democrats or the Tories supported that in the bill when it came to a vote. And I think, there's an old convention in politics that the vote follows the voice. If you're in favour of widening access, then I think those parties should have voted for it. But let me just say another point about student support that Neil has raised. Very important we put this on the record. I have this folder open only because I want to be absolutely accurate in quoting Robin Parker, the just retired president of the NUS in Scotland. He says, and this was said last year when we were putting in place our new student support arrangements, he said, Scotland will have the best support package in the whole of the UK available to college and university students studying at higher education level. That is the fact. It is attained to by Robin and a variety of others. That's what we're doing, and I am by no means unsympathetic of continuing to ensure that that package is the best in all these islands.
Okay. Pauline?
Okay, so I think wrapped up in this is a number of different issues. The first thing is it's about access, but access isn't just about free education. It's actually about being able to afford to go to university. My daughter's in university at the moment. Believe you me, it is not cheap, even though her fees are free. So we've got an issue there. The second issue really is, how do we perceive education? Do we perceive it as being something that is for social good? Do we see it as being something that addresses social justice? Do we see it as something that addresses mobility across classes? And I think the third thing about it is, at the end of the day, if you get those right, and if you actually put in place, as the Green Party would, which is a citizen's income, it recognises that access has to be about giving people not just the opportunity, not just paying for them to go, but actually allowing them to truly immerse themselves in that experience by actually not having to work. And I know not having to work sometimes 25 hours a week and still be a full-time student. Because yes, it's free to go to university, but guess what? It pays when you get there. It pays £365, my daughter pays for 1 bedroom in a flat in Edinburgh. Okay, that's the reality of it. So the notion that this is all about free access and free tuition is actually only half the issue. And ultimately, if we believe it is good for society, as I believe, and it comes back to what we've been talking all night, this is about priorities. Do we think the right to education is a basic human right? And if we do, then when it comes to budgets, then we have to prioritise some things. And whether you pay 2p in the pound extra in your taxes, or whether you end up taking out a student loan, the reality of the matter is it has to be paid for. Personally, I think it should be paid through the state. But that's my choice, and I think it's an important enough priority for all of those reasons I've just explained to think that it's worth giving them an income.
Would you increase taxes?
Yes, I've just said yes. I think there's a real issue here. I think the sooner we realise if we want a good society, we have to pay for it. If you want American society, where you are thrown on the heap without welfare, then yes, go for 10% tax. If you want a truly fair society that gives people opportunities, it has to be paid for. Now, I personally would prefer to pay 2p, 3p extra in my tax. But believe you me...
Okay. Liz, do you want to come back on some of Mike's points from earlier?
One point. I take exception to Mike Russell arguing that we're against widening access. That is categorically untrue. What we objected to was some of the means by which you were attempting to do that. But I will not have you say that we were voting against widening access. Where I would like to see... We voted against the way in which you put that...
against widening access, alas, and I wish you hadn't, but you did.
That is not true.
And I'm sorry.
Well, I'm sorry.
To show it's there.
I can prove...
Did you vote for the bill or didn't you?
I did not vote for the bill.
You voted against widening access?
I did not vote against widening access, and neither did my colleagues. The whole point is that the focus about widening access should be much more on schools, because that is one of the ways where we need to attract more people who have the aspiration to get into the universities, who come from families who probably have not had that aspiration before. That's where the focus of your policy ought to be, not necessarily in the way that you went about the post-16 bill.
Okay. Neil, if you can cover that briefly, and we'll take
just
one
to respond to the
question.
point about the post-16 bill that Mike Russell was referring to, Labour absolutely supports widening access. We voted against the post-16 bill because of the complete mess and roughshod you're overseeing over college reform, Mr Russell, and also the widening access legislation didn't go far enough, and there's not been was no additional money put alongside the bill to create the places. It's all very well having it in law. You have to put in the money to create the extra widening access places. So if you're serious about widening access, Mr Russell, put your money where your mouth is.
Okay.
Can I just say how much money we do put in there?
Very
We
brief,
put
very
considerable
briefly.
sums of money into it. There's an old story about Wynfor Evans, the leader of the Welsh Nationalists, who once said to Winnie Young in the House of Commons, when they offer you half a loaf, even if you want a whole loaf, take the half, because that's what people deserve. Widening access has improved as a result of the bill. I worked very hard to try and bring on board the other parties. They voted against widening access. I wish they hadn't, but I'm glad we had a majority because we got widening access through.
What about college cuts?
Okay.
And we've now got a better college sector, a much better college
okay,
sector,
excellent.
thank goodness.
Right. This chap here has been very patient for questions.
I've got no doubt that the Scottish Government are going to continue to do well for universities. I think they are impeded globally, and I've got a sort of personal experience. My wife's from South Africa. She's from a very wealthy family. My brother-in-law, money is no object. He was studying in South Africa, exceptional physicist. He'd done a degree and wanted to continue doing research elsewhere in the world. He looked at the top 50 universities. There's 3 in Scotland, 1 in Germany. He looked at the States, and it comes back to the point where the British consulate all the embassy staff are geared towards England, to the southeast, particularly London-based universities, and Oxford, of course, and Cambridge. There is almost no literature or any information about Scotland. We've got 3 exceptional universities wanting to offer research grants and all sorts of investment and opportunity in physics. He ended up going to UCLA in the States. He now lives there. She's got a younger brother, and he's very interested. And I think that the money that he's going to put in, the money that foreign students do put into universities, is so vital for their life, especially when, particularly down south, they are cutting back, and we are investing here. How are we going to continue to attract that kind of academic and that kind of opportunity even for Scotland? You know, for the kind of discoveries and the things that they're working on, the opportunities. I think he's even working on some really big projects in UCLA, and he could have been doing it here.
Okay. A good thought to conclude on, but if I can just take very briefly from every panellist, I suppose their ideal scenario for higher education this time next year. If we can start with Pete and then work our way to the right.
Well,
but keep it quite brief.
I would echo Pauline's point. Higher education is not free. It's expensive. It's very expensive, and the point just made, to do it exceptionally well and to do it incredibly competitively, as Scottish universities have been doing for 600 years. And we need to keep doing that. Scottish universities are absolutely the lifeblood of the future economic prosperity and the cultural well-being of Scotland. And therefore, it is about priorities. Now, University of Scotland's position on this is constitutionally blind, if you like. It doesn't matter what the constitutional outcome is, provided that we, as universities, can persuade any government of any colour and any hue that its universities are vital for its future, and they're willing to find the means to prioritise the support and the competitive support for universities in the future.
Mike?
I hope we'll continue.
You obviously want a yes vote.
I do want a yes vote. I would take that as read, but as you have already received a yes publication when you arrived this evening, I know you're converted. I want.
Is that your usual polling evidence? Is it, Mike?
And we have plenty more for this audience as well. I want to have a university system and a whole education system that's based on the ability to learn, not the ability to pay. That's axiomatic, and it arises, I think, not just out of Scottish traditions, but out of basic human rights. But I want something else, because we've been a little short this evening on the wider context of independence. I see everybody in Scotland as essentially a co-negotiator of independence. Everybody in this room, even if you're not thinking about voting yes, even if you're certain you won't vote yes, you can see ways in which this country can be a better country to live in. And over the next year, the debate we should have is how you see that happening, what you want to see happen, and then help to achieve it. That might be help for you short of independence. Maybe you don't think that's a good idea. But this is an enormously exciting time to live in. It is, I was quoting to somebody earlier today a remark from John Adams, the second president of the United States, somebody who helped draft the Declaration of Independence. He talked about the amazing opportunity his generation had been given to essentially invent government anew, to have the choice of how they were governed. That is a unique opportunity in Scotland. I think it's enormously exciting to have it. Please join in the process of envisioning, imagining a better country, and tell us how that should be and help to create it. If we do that over the next year, then we will come out on the 19th of September. I hope we'll come out as an independent country, but we'll come out as a better country.
Liz?
I want to see our universities in Scotland remain first class. In Dundee, you are at the cutting edge of so much. I want that to continue. I want you to welcome students from all around the world and staff from all around the world who have the ability to make this a leading university. To do that, for me, I think you need to have a vision of stability. You have to compete, as I say, in a very global world where collaboration, knowledge exchange is at the forefront. To have that, I believe that we need to stay in the union so that we have the benefits of being able to do that.
Okay, thank you. Neil?
My hope is that universities like Dundee and Scottish universities continue to thrive. They continue to benefit from the fact that we've got 270 embassies across the globe. We continue to benefit from UK Research Council funding. I hope the SNP government reverse their cuts to bursaries for the poorest students, and I think the best way to ensure this happens is to vote to maintain Scotland's partnership with the rest of the UK.
Gail?
Giving me the mic. He doesn't. We knew that would happen. Just to answer that chap's question directly, well, Scotland could have its own embassies and push its universities worldwide, and we can more than afford that because we already pay for our embassies. We already contribute 9.9 to the UK. We already contribute 9.9% into the UK Treasury and get less than that back, which is incidentally £4.4 billion, which relates to that 4 billion figure of supposed deficit Scotland will have. So on day one of independence, we can more than afford it. And then it's about making and choosing the right choices and the right priorities. For me, the priorities are student support. They are retaining free education, but it's also about making sure that once people graduate, there is a marketplace and there are jobs for them to go to. We need the decision-making powers in our hands. We need the fiscal levers of an independent state to ensure that young people don't have to go abroad and waste their education, and Scotland isn't able to retain the investment they've made in their lives. So for me, I'm voting yes, because I want to protect free education and I want to protect the future of Scotland.
Thank you. Liam?
Well, I'm glad Gail answered the chap's question, because he'd waited with his hand up for the best part of about half an hour.
We got to him a bit.
Well, I think perhaps point out a shortcoming in Gail's response there was that we will not have, on the basis of what's proposed, the economic and fiscal levers in our own hands, because the SNP have made very, very clear that their preference is to maintain the pound, and that's the whole coot and caboodle, Gail. In terms of the point you make about the network, I think you're absolutely right. There are shortcomings in the way both our immigration system works. I dare say there are shortcomings in the way that our embassy system works. But I think simply trying to then logically remove yourself from that rather than seek to amend it and make it work more productively in our favour, for as all of us have agreed, what is a jewel in our crown and a real asset for a whole variety of reasons, I think would be a mistake. I think that as a party, we have been committed to the genuine Home Rule. I think we've been the driver behind that through the Constitutional Convention, establishment of the Scottish Parliament, Calman process. We have set out to the Campbell Commission where we think we need to go with more powers, but we need to settle whether or not we're in this union. That's not an argument for saying there's no change within that union. It can clearly work better and harder for Scotland, but I think it would be a mistake to turn our back on that.
Okay, and last but certainly not least, Polly.
Yes, well, on the 19th of September next year, we're in a newly independent Scotland. I'm hoping that we'll be sitting down to write a constitution where the right to access to free education is actually enshrined within that. And if we're not, if the Green Party aren't leading, then that's fine, but we'll certainly be pushing the SNP to commit to what they've said they would do, which is actually to enshrine it, and for it to be more than just about free education in the sense of free tuition, but that's a truly free educational experience. And if it's enshrined in Constitution as a basic right, then I think we've some guarantee that we might achieve it.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all the panellists for what I think was a very lively debate, which ranged across certainly most of the issues I hoped would be covered, and that I hope you did too. So it just remains to thank everyone very much. Stay where you are.
Stay where you are.
For a second.
Just before you go, can I just? I programmed to do a vote of thanks, and I'll foreshorten that, but I do want to say one or two things at the end of this event. I was going to begin by saying I'd like you to envisage me, maybe you shouldn't do this, but I was thinking how I felt when I went to bed last night. And I was profoundly disappointed, profoundly depressed, actually, and that is because I'd watched BBC Newsnight's Independence special, which I thought was profoundly disappointing. The level of debate was poor, and there was inter-party squabbling and prepared short speeches, which I guess the media demand these days. But tonight, I'm going to go to bed much happier, because we've just heard, actually, in the evidence of why we set up 5 Million Questions, which was to provide a space for reflection, for serious thought and discussion about some of the big issues surrounding the independence referendum. We've had tonight an example of splendid chairmanship, from which some of our BBC colleagues could learn a great deal. Firm, fair, and a facilitator, rather than an aggressive, combative Kirsty Watt.
I can do that too.
I really do want to thank you for being here tonight. Thanks very much for attending a joint DUSA 5 Million Questions event. But I do want to end by, apart from thanking our speakers, say this, that there are going to be other, we're ramping up the programme events under the 5 Million Questions banner, if you like. On the 30th of October, we've got Blair v Blair, which is the leaders of the respective yes and no campaigns. On the 22nd of November, we have In Conversation with Douglas Alexander, but we're very fair. And in the 2nd of December, we're having In Conversation with Nicola Sturgeon. So you're very welcome. Well, I hope to see you all back at those events, and many more people too, because not only are we intent on being the leading university here in 25 years, we want to be the leading university in terms of providing a space for serious debate about the referendum issue in Scotland. Thanks very much.